The worst thing about loving someone in silence is that you become very good at pretending you feel nothing, and eventually, you stop knowing the difference. Ivy had spent 3 years perfecting that particular lie. She told it every morning when she braided her pale hair in front of the cracked mirror above her wash basin, smoothing her expression into something careful and unremarkable before descending the stone stairs into the great hall of Veldrath Keep. She told it at every council gathering, every meal in the long dining corridor, every moment she stood at the edge of a room while Leander's voice filled it completely. Low, unhurried, absolute. She told it so many times that the lie had worn grooves into her chest, the way a river wears grooves into limestone, slowly, invisibly, until the stone gives way. She was 24 years old, an Omega without a wolf, and she had no business feeling anything for the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. She knew that. She had always known that. It didn't change a single thing. The morning it all broke open began like every other morning in Veldrath. Gray light through tall, leaded windows, the smell of wood smoke drifting up from the lower hearths, the distant sound of hooves on cobblestone as the dawn patrol returned from the forest perimeter. Ivy was already awake before the candles in the corridor were relit. She sat at the narrow desk in the small room she'd been assigned 3 years ago. The Omega's room, the staff called it, without cruelty, but without kindness either. And she was reading a letter she had not been meant to find. She discovered it folded inside a ledger she was meant to update. Someone had slipped it there carelessly, assuming the records room was empty by nightfall. It had been. But Ivy had returned after supper to finish the inventory she'd been assigned, her tallow candle burning low, and when the paper slid from between the pages and fell open on the desk in front of her, she read it, before she understood what she was reading. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still for a long time, with the candle guttering beside her and the cold seeping through the stone floor into her bare feet. And she felt the ground tilt slowly beneath everything she thought she understood about her place in this keep. The letter was from Lord Kalen Drev, Beta Commander of the Eastern Reach, a man she had sat across from at formal dinners a dozen times, a man who smiled with too many teeth and smelled of pine resin and something metallic she had never been able to name. It was addressed to someone she knew only as R, and it described in careful and businesslike language a negotiation. The subject of the negotiation was Ivy herself, not her name. The letter referred to her as the unmated Omega currently housed in Veldrath, as though she were an item in an inventory, which, she was beginning to understand, was precisely what she was to Lord Kalen Drev. The letter outlined a proposal, that she be transferred from Veldrath under the pretense of a formal placement, relocated to the Drev estate in the Eastern Reach, and there used as leverage to pressure the Alpha King into a territorial concession he had refused 3 times. The king is not indifferent to the Omega, the letter read. He does not act on it, but he does not send her away. That is enough. A man will concede more to protect something he values than to gain something he wants. Ivy's hands had stopped trembling by then. She was past trembling. She was somewhere colder and more deliberate than fear. She read the line again. He does not act on it, but he does not send her away. She folded the letter along its original creases, tucked it inside the front of her linen dress, and sat quietly for a moment in the dark room with the ledger open and the candle nearly gone. Outside, wind moved through the pines at the edge of the keep's outer wall. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers. She thought about Leander. She thought about the way he never spoke to her directly in public. Not because he was unkind, but because his attention was the kind of attention that drew notice, and he was careful. She had understood that carefulness as distance, as professional courtesy extended to a dependent ward, as nothing. She thought about the night 6 months ago when she'd been ill with a fever that wouldn't break, and she had woken in the dark to find a fresh wool blanket folded across the foot of her bed that hadn't been there when she fell asleep, smelling faintly of cedar and cold night air. She had told herself one of the servants had brought it. She thought about every time she'd looked up across a crowded room and found his pale blue eyes already on her, and the way they shifted away immediately, with the deliberate calm of a man who had practiced that particular movement. She had told herself she imagined it. He does not act on it. But he does not send her away. Lord Kaelin Drev had seen something that Ivy had spent 3 years refusing to see, and he intended to use it to break the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. She did not go to Leander. That was the decision she made in the dark room, with the candle dead and the embers cooling. She could not go to him. If she walked into his study and laid the letter on his desk, she would be confirming everything Kaelin had written, that she was a vulnerability, that her presence in this keep was a liability, that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories had a weakness, and it wore a gray wool cloak and braided its hair each morning over a cracked mirror. Leander would thank her, carefully. He would be furious at Kaelin in private, and then he would arrange for her to be moved somewhere safer, somewhere far from here, because a man like Leander did not keep vulnerabilities close. She would lose even this, the small daily geography of him, the low voice in the corridor, the blue eyes that moved away too quickly. She was not willing to lose it. Not yet. Not without understanding what it meant. So instead, she sat in the dark, and she thought very carefully, the way she had learned to think in the years since she'd come to Veldrath without a wolf, without status, without anything but the ability to be useful and quiet and unnoticed. She thought about Lord Kaelin Drev and his letter, and the person he'd addressed it to, R. And she thought about the territorial concession Leander had refused 3 times. And she thought about what it would mean if Kaelin succeeded. Then she thought about what it would take to make him fail. By the time gray dawn light began to seep under her door, she had the beginning of something that was not quite a plan but was at least a direction. It was dangerous. It was also, she realized, with a strange and unfamiliar feeling settling into her chest beside the fear, the first time in 3 years that she had decided to do something for herself, rather than simply endure. She rose from the desk, smoothed her dress, and went to find Maren. Maren was the only person in Veldrath Keep that Ivy trusted without reservation. She was 60 years old, built like a stone wall, and she had been head housekeeper of Veldrath since before Leander's father had died, and left the Northern Territories to a 22-year-old alpha who hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for the first year of his rule. Maren had fed that young alpha warm broth at his own desk when he forgot to eat. She had also, 3 years ago, been the one to show Ivy to her room and say, without preamble, "You're safe here. Don't make it complicated and you'll be fine." Ivy had never made it complicated. Until now. She found Maren in the linen stores off the East Corridor, counting pillowcases with the focused expression of a woman who considered domestic order a moral virtue. Ivy closed the door behind her, pulled the letter from inside her dress, and held it out. Maren read it once, set it down on the linen shelf, read it again. "How long has Kaelin Drev been corresponding with someone inside this keep?" Maren said. It was not a question. "I don't know. Long enough to have formed a plan." Maren's jaw was very tight. "Who is R?" "I don't know that either, but I think I know how to find out." The older woman looked at her. Really looked, the way she rarely did, as though she was reassessing something she thought she'd already understood. "You're not frightened." "I'm terrified," Ivy said honestly. "But I'm also angry. That's new." Maren was quiet for a moment. Outside the small window at the end of the linen corridor, frost still clung to the inner courtyard stones. Then she picked up the letter, folded it neatly, and handed it back. "Tell me what you need," she said. Ivy's plan, in its earliest form, was built on a single truth that Lord Kaelin Drev had accidentally given her. If her presence in Veldrath was valuable to him precisely because of what Leander felt, or what Leander would not say, then the most dangerous thing she could do was make that feeling impossible to ignore. Not for Kaelin's benefit, for her own. She needed to understand what was real before she decided how to protect it. And she needed Leander off balance enough that his careful, practiced distance might slip, just once, and show her something true underneath. It was not a comfortable plan. It required her to behave in ways that felt deeply unnatural, which was perhaps why it also felt, beneath the fear, like the first honest thing she had done in years. The second part of the plan was quieter and more dangerous. Find R. She gave herself 4 days for both. The Northern Territories received a diplomatic party on the second morning after Ivy found the letter. She had not known they were coming. She was not the kind of person who received advance notices of diplomatic arrivals. But Marin had told her the night before, in the low, practical tone she used for all important information. Lord Bastian Vorn of the Thornfeld pack was traveling through with a small retinue, requesting 1 night's hospitality and a brief audience with the Alpha King on a matter of border trade. Routine. Unremarkable. Except that Lord Bastian Vorn was also, by widespread acknowledgement, the most aggressively charming beta lord in the Western Territories, and he was 30 years old and unmarried, and had, on his last visit to Veldrath 2 years prior, spent an entire formal dinner making every woman at the table feel as though she were the only person in the room. Ivy remembered that dinner. She had been seated at the far end of the table, too low in rank to warrant his notice. He had not looked at her once. She intended to change that. She dressed more carefully than usual that morning. Not extravagantly. She didn't own anything extravagant, but with attention. She exchanged her habitual gray wool cloak for a deep blue one that Marin had produced from somewhere without comment, and she wore her best linen dress with the small embroidered border at the collar. She left her braid looser than normal, softer at the edges. She borrowed a small pot of rose salve from the head dressing maid, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She looked, when she studied herself in the cracked mirror, like a woman who had decided to be noticed. The feeling was deeply uncomfortable. She stood with it anyway. The diplomatic party arrived mid-morning, boots loud on the cobblestones, horses steaming in the cold air. Ivy positioned herself at the edge of the inner courtyard, under the pretense of delivering a household record to the steward's office, a task she had volunteered for specifically, and she watched the retinue dismount. Lord Bastian Vorn was easy to identify. Tall, easy in his movements, a dark wool riding coat, dark hair pushed back from a broad face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of pleasant confidence. He spoke to his men with a hand on one of their shoulders, laughing at something. And then he turned toward the keep entrance, and his eyes swept the courtyard in the casual way of a man who had learned early that looking cost nothing. His eyes found Ivy. Paused. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away toward the steward's office as though she had somewhere important to be. She heard him say something to the man beside him. She didn't catch the words, but she heard the shift in tone. Good enough for now. She did not see Leander until the formal welcome in the great hall that afternoon. He stood at the head of the room in his habitual black leather, and the dark fur mantle that made his already considerable presence feel larger still. His braided hair tied back, his pale blue eyes moving over the assembled household with the unhurried attention of a man who catalogued everything and reacted to nothing. He greeted Lord Bastian with the precise warmth of a host who is neither cold nor particularly interested, and the two of them exchanged the standard diplomatic courtesies with the practiced ease of men who had done this many times. Ivy stood with the household staff along the left wall, which was her correct place. She was watching Leander the way she always watched him when she thought no one would notice. Carefully, from the periphery, reading the small things. The set of his jaw. The way his weight shifted when a conversation was making demands, he found tiresome. The brief stillness that came over him sometimes when something caught his attention that he hadn't expected. That stillness came over him now. Lord Bastian had crossed the hall on some pretense of greeting the household, genuinely good-natured, or performing it so well the difference didn't matter. And he had arrived in front of Ivy with his pleasant expression and an inclination of his head that was warmer than courtesy strictly required. "I don't believe we were properly introduced at my last visit," he said. "I'm told you manage a significant portion of the household records. Lord Bastian Vorn, Thornfeld." Ivy kept her voice even. "Ivy, I assist with records and correspondence management." She paused one beat too long before adding, "I remember your last visit, my lord. You made a strong impression at the dining table." His smile widened slightly. "I hope a good one." "Memorable," she said, which was not quite the same thing. And she could see from the slight brightening of his expression that he'd heard it as a compliment, and found that interesting. She did not look at Leander. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the room the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not heard, not seen. Something older and more physical than either. The particular quality of stillness from the head of the hall had changed. It had become the stillness of attention, rather than the stillness of distance. Her heart was doing something she refused to examine in detail. That evening's dinner was more useful than she had anticipated. Lord Bastian, as it turned out, had the entirely genuine habit of seeking out the most interesting person in a room, rather than the most important one, and he had apparently decided Ivy qualified. He was seated well above her in rank, but twice during the meal he directed remarks down the table toward her specifically. Once about a trade record she had apparently mentioned in passing being misattributed in the Thornfeld archives, and once about something wittier and less official that made the people around her laugh. Both times, Ivy responded with the dry precision that came naturally to her when she wasn't performing invisibility, and both times she saw Lord Bastian's expression sharpen with the specific pleasure of someone who has found unexpectedly good conversation. The third time he looked toward her, she glanced past him just briefly, toward the head of the table. Leander was not looking at Lord Bastian. He was looking at Ivy. Not the quick, immediately corrected glance she had catalogued over 3 years. He was looking at her with the focused, unguarded attention of a man who had been caught off guard and had not yet managed to reassemble his composure. His pale blue eyes were entirely still. His jaw was set. One hand rested flat on the table beside his goblet, and she could see, even at this distance, that it was not relaxed. She looked away first. Her pulse was loud in her ears. He does not act on it, but he does not send her away. Kaelin Drev had been right, and Leander, for once, was not being careful. She found R that same night. It happened indirectly, which was perhaps why she hadn't anticipated it. After dinner, she returned to the records room on the pretense of finishing work she'd left incomplete, and she was genuinely working, cross-referencing correspondence logs against the household ledger, looking for any name that might resolve to a single initial, when she heard voices in the corridor outside. She recognized the first voice immediately, Lord Kaelin Drev, who had arrived the previous week under the stated purpose of discussing garrison supply routes with the keep's quartermaster. She had been careful around him since finding the letter. She was careful now, setting down her quill and moving to stand beside the door without touching it. The second voice took her longer to place. It was quieter, lower, deliberately suppressed. But when she caught the rhythm of it, the particular way certain syllables flattened, the habit of trailing sentences into silence, she knew. Roland. Roland was the Alpha King's personal steward. He had served in that role for 6 years. He was 53 years old, thin and efficient, and trusted completely. Leander had once said, in Ivy's hearing, that he would rather lose a beta commander than lose Roland, because a good steward knew where every secret in a keep was buried. That was, Ivy now understood, precisely the problem. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall beside the door, and she listened, very carefully, with her hands clasped tight in front of her, and her breathing shallow and controlled, while Kaelin Drev and Roland spoke in the corridor about timing, about the Thornfeld Lord's visit being an inconvenience, about waiting until the diplomatic party departed before proceeding with the transfer arrangement. Her transfer. Her removal from Veldrath, wrapped in the language of proper placement and Omega welfare. Roland said, "The king will ask questions." Kaelin said, "Let him. By the time he understands what has happened, the concession will already have been made. He won't undo it for an Omega with no wolf and no rank." A pause. Then Roland, quieter. "He cares more than you think." Kaelin's voice was entirely indifferent. Then he should have said so. Their footsteps moved away down the corridor, and Ivy stood in the dark records room with her heart beating very slowly and her mind arranging itself into something clean and deliberate and cold. Roland. 6 years of trust. And Roland. She picked up her quill, returned to the ledger, and wrote a single name on the corner of her working page. Then she tore it off, folded it, and tucked it into her dress beside Kaylin's letter. Tomorrow, she would go to Marin. And then, one way or another, she would go to Leander. Not because she had no choice, because she had finally decided to stop pretending she felt nothing, and to find out, once and for all, whether he had too. Marin listened without interrupting, which was how Ivy knew she was truly alarmed. When Ivy finished, the corridor, the voices, Roland's name spoken in the dark with the particular weight of a thing she could not unknow, the older woman sat very still at the small table in the linen stores with her hands folded in front of her and her expression doing something complicated and controlled. Outside the narrow window, early morning fog still hung over the inner courtyard, softening the edges of the stone walls, turning the keep into something that looked, from the right angle, almost gentle. It wasn't. "Roland," Marin said finally. One word, flat and final, like a stone dropped into still water. "Yes." 6 years. "Yes." Marin exhaled slowly through her nose. "How certain are you?" "Completely." Ivy placed the folded letter on the table, then the torn page with Roland's name. Kaylin used the word transfer. Roland knew exactly what he meant. He didn't object to the plan, only to the timing. The older woman looked at the 2 pieces of paper for a long moment. Then she looked at Ivy with something Ivy didn't often see directed at herself. Respect, careful and undecorated. "You should have come to the king immediately, last night." "I know. Why didn't you?" Ivy was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. Part of it was strategy. She had needed to think clearly before walking into that study. Needed to have the full shape of the threat in her hands rather than a partial picture. But part of it was something older and less rational. The fear that Leander's first response would be to protect the keep by removing the vulnerability, that she would walk in with the evidence of a conspiracy and walk out with a formal arrangement for her relocation to somewhere safe and distant, and that Leander would do it kindly, carefully, and she would have no argument against kindness. She said only, "I needed to be certain." Marin studied her. "And now?" "Now I am." She went to his study alone. Marin had offered to accompany her, and Ivy had declined, because what she was about to do required a particular kind of courage that only worked in private. She walked the long stone corridor from the east wing to the keep's upper floor, with the 2 pieces of paper held flat against her palm inside her cloak, and she did not let herself think too carefully about what came after. Thinking too carefully had been, for 3 years, the mechanism by which she had successfully avoided feeling anything. She was done with that particular tool. The guard outside Leander's study was a broad, quiet man named Soren, who had never been unkind to her. He looked at her with mild surprise. She did not typically request private audiences, and then stepped aside and knocked once before opening the door. "The Omega Ivy, my lord." A pause. Then Leander's voice, even and unhurried. "Let her in." He was at the large desk near the window when she entered, standing rather than seated, one hand braced on the surface amid the organized scatter of maps and correspondence that she recognized from delivering records here twice a month for 3 years. He was in his working clothes, black leather, the crossed straps of his harness, no formal mantle, and the morning light from the tall leaded window behind him was gray and flat, and made his pale blue eyes look almost silver. He watched her cross the room without speaking. She stopped at a reasonable distance from the desk and held out the letter. "I found this 4 days ago inside a ledger I was updating. I need you to read it." Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but a sharpening. He took the letter, unfolded it, and read it. She watched him read it. His expression did not change significantly, but his stillness changed quality, the way it had changed in the great hall the previous evening, from the stillness of control to the stillness of something being held very carefully in check. He set the letter on the desk. Where was this ledger? Records room, east corridor, lower shelf. Someone used it as a hiding place carelessly. When did you find it? 4 nights ago. His eyes came up to hers. You waited 4 days. I needed to know who R was before I came to you. I found out last night. She placed the torn page beside the letter. Roland. I heard him speaking with Kaylin Drev in the East Corridor after dinner. They discussed the timing of my transfer. Roland knew the full plan. The quality of silence in the room changed completely. Leander looked at Roland's name on the torn page for a long moment. His jaw was very tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was exactly as level as it always was, which told her more than any other reaction would have. You heard this yourself. Clearly and without ambiguity. Kaylin used the word transfer. Roland's concern was only the timing, Lord Bastion's visit being an inconvenience to the plan. He did not object to the plan itself. Leander was quiet. He picked up the letter again, read a specific section. She knew which one. Could have identified the line from across the room, and then set it down again with the careful deliberateness of a man managing something that would otherwise be unmanageable. She had decided, in the corridor last night, that she would not make this easy for him. She had decided that the careful, maintained distance between them had protected her for 3 years, and had also cost her 3 years, and that Kaylin Drev's letter had, among its many violations, at least forced a reckoning she would not have forced herself. There is a line in that letter, she said, that I think you should address directly. He looked at her, waiting. The king is not indifferent to the Omega. He does not act on it, but he does not send her away. She kept her voice steady. Kaylin Drev built an entire political strategy on what he read in your behavior toward me. I would like to know if he read it correctly. The silence stretched. Outside the high window, wind moved through the pines at the forest edge, and somewhere below in the courtyard, a horse shifted against cobblestones. Inside the study, the fire on the far wall had burned down to steady coals, and the room smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the cedar that she had for 3 years, associated with that unexplained blanket left at the foot of her bed on a cold night. Leander set both hands flat on the desk. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. Yes, he said. He read it correctly. The word landed in the center of her chest and stayed there, warm and terrifying and entirely real. She had expected it. In the abstract way you expect something you have hoped for so long, it has become almost theoretical. The actual experience of it was different. Her breathing changed. She kept her face still by an effort of will that she hoped wasn't visible. How long? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision of a man who had decided in the span of 30 seconds to stop being careful. Since the winter you had the fever that wouldn't break. I sat outside your door for 2 hours before I decided leaving a blanket was a more appropriate response than walking in. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. That was 18 months ago. Yes. You said nothing. You have no wolf. His voice was very even, which she understood now as the effort it cost him rather than the absence of feeling. You were placed in my household as a ward under my protection. You are an Omega in a world that assigns your worth by rank and shift status. What I felt was not something I had the right to act on without your knowledge, and I had no reason to believe you shared it. So I said nothing. She thought about 3 years of careful glances and immediate corrections. 3 years of distance that she had read as indifference, and that had apparently been the most elaborate act of restraint she had ever failed to recognize. I have shared it, she said, for 3 years. I was also saying nothing. Something happened in his expression that she had never seen there before. It was not dramatic. It was simply the look of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a long time and has just been told he could set it down. He straightened from the desk. Ivy, we can discuss this further after Roland and Kaylin Drev have been dealt with, she said, because she needed a moment that wasn't this. Needed to return to the solid ground of strategy before she lost her footing entirely. But I wanted you to know before we proceeded that I did not come to you only because I was frightened. I came to you because you are the person I trust with this. That is also true. He looked at her for a long moment with the full weight of his attention, undivided and unguarded, and she felt it the way you feel the first warmth of a fire after being very cold for a very long time. "We'll deal with them today," he said. "And then we'll finish this conversation." Leander moved the way he made every decision, without hesitation and without noise. Within the hour, Soren had been quietly reassigned to stand outside Roland's private quarters, under a pretense that would not raise alarm. A routine security review during a diplomatic visit. Perfectly ordinary. Lord Bastion's party was scheduled to depart by midday, and Leander had arranged a brief, cordial farewell audience that would keep Kaelin Drev in the Great Hall and away from the East Corridor for the duration of the morning. None of this was announced. None of it was visible. It simply happened, the way things happened when a man who had governed the Northern Territories for 12 years decided something needed to be done. Ivy watched it from the periphery and felt, for the first time in 4 days, something loosen in her chest. She was still frightened. The fear was real, and she did not pretend otherwise, even to herself. But underneath the fear, there was something new, something she was still learning the shape of. The particular steadiness that comes from being seen clearly by someone who does not look away. Leander had seen the letter. He had heard her account of the corridor. He had looked at Roland's name and said nothing that was not necessary, and then he had moved. He had not told her she should have come sooner. He had not suggested she step back and allow the matter to be handled without her. He had, instead, asked her what she had observed, and listened to her answers, with the focused attention of a man receiving intelligence from a source he trusted. That was new too. The confrontation with Roland happened in the study, mid-morning, with the fire rebuilt and the gray light pressing flat against the high windows. Leander had the letter on the desk when Roland was brought in, and he said nothing for a long moment after the door closed. Simply looked at the man who had served him for 6 years with the pale, level attention that Ivy had come to understand was not coldness, but the absolute containment of something much larger. Roland saw the letter immediately. His face changed. To his credit, or perhaps to the credit of 6 years of proximity to a man who valued precision, he did not attempt to deny it. He stood in front of the desk with his thin shoulders drawn back, and his expression doing the complicated work of someone who has been found out and is deciding, in real time, whether the cause was worth the cost. "Lord Kaelin approached me 14 months ago," Roland said. His voice was steady. "He offered financial security for my family in the Eastern Reach. My daughter's husband has debts I could not cover. I told myself the arrangement was minor, administrative, that no one would be seriously harmed." Leander said nothing. "I understand that is not a defense." "No," Leander said. "It isn't." Ivy stood near the wall to the left of the desk. She had been uncertain, when Leander asked her to be present, whether her place was here or outside. But he had asked without preamble, and she had understood that she was being included as a matter of course, not as a courtesy. She was the person who had uncovered this. She was owed the resolution. She watched Roland's face as he was questioned. She watched him account for everything, the correspondence he had forwarded, the household records he had quietly altered to make her status appear more ambiguous than it was, the timing he had arranged with Kaelin for the proposed transfer. He answered each question with the exhausted precision of a man who had been carrying a secret for over a year, and was, beneath the shame, almost relieved to put it down. When it was done, Leander was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your family's financial situation will be reviewed and addressed through proper channels. Your daughter's husband's debts will be settled once, as severance. You will leave Veldrath by nightfall, and you will not return. You will not communicate with Kaelin Drev, or with anyone connected to the Eastern Reach arrangement. If you do, the full account of this conversation will be made public." He paused. "You served this household well for 6 years before this. I am choosing to remember that. Do not make me regret it." Roland looked at him. Then, unexpectedly, he looked at Ivy. Not with hostility, but with something tired and complicated. "I am sorry," he said, "for what it is worth." She held his gaze. "It is worth something," she said. "Not everything, but something." He was escorted out. Kaelin Drev was a different matter entirely. He did not have Roland's exhaustion or Roland's residual conscience. He was brought to the study an hour later, after Lord Bastion's party had departed the gates and the keep had returned to its ordinary rhythms. And he entered with the composed confidence of a man who did not yet understand the ground had shifted entirely beneath him. He saw Ivy standing near the wall, and something moved briefly across his face. Assessment, recalibration. Before he arranged his expression back into its habitual pleasantness, Leander placed the letter on the desk and said, "Sit down." Kalen looked at the letter. His composure held, which told Ivy something about the quality of his arrogance. He had considered the possibility of being caught, and had decided in advance that he could manage it. "I can explain the intent of that correspondence," he began. "You referred to a person under my protection as a transferable asset," Leander said. His voice was entirely level. "You engaged my personal steward in a conspiracy to remove her from this keep without my knowledge. You intended to use her welfare as leverage to extract a territorial concession. I have refused 3 times through proper diplomatic process." He paused. "Explain which part of that you believe requires clarification." Kalen's pleasant expression did not entirely disappear, but it thinned. "The Northern Territory's refusal to recognize Thornfeld border rights has caused significant economic pressure on the Eastern Reach. I acted in the interest of—" "You acted in your own interest," Ivy said. Both men looked at her. She had not planned to speak, but the words were already out, clear and even, and she did not retract them. "You didn't act for the Eastern Reach," she continued. "You acted for yourself. The concession you wanted benefits your personal trade agreements, not the broader pack. Roland told you the king cares more than you think. Your response was that he should have said so." She met Kalen's eyes steadily. "You were right about that. He should have. But you built your plan on the assumption that silence means weakness. It doesn't. It means patience, and you mistook it." Kalen looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Leander. Something in his assessment was shifting. She could see it, the moment he understood that she was not a ward being passively protected, that she was standing where she was standing because she had been placed there, and that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was watching him with the expression of a man whose patience had reached its precise and final limit. "The Eastern Reach seat on the Northern Council is suspended pending a full review of your conduct," Leander said. "Your correspondence for the past 2 years will be examined. You will return to your estate, and you will not take any political action, make any trade agreement, or communicate with any allied territory without written approval from this office, until the review is complete." He let that settle for one moment. "If the review finds further evidence of conspiracy against the crown or its protected persons, the suspension becomes permanent removal. Am I understood?" It was not a question. Kalen Drev understood. He stood, adjusted his riding coat with the careful movements of a man preserving what dignity remained to him, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "She has no wolf," he said, not cruelly, almost curiously, as though he still could not resolve the discrepancy. "She is an unmated Omega with no rank and no shift. And you—" "Leave," Leander said. He left. The study was quiet after that. The fire on the far wall had been rebuilt and burned steadily, and the room smelled of wood smoke and old leather, and the particular cold clarity that follows a confrontation when everything that needed to be said has finally been said. Ivy stood near the wall and felt the last 4 days drain out of her slowly, like water out of cupped hands. She was tired in a way that went deeper than her body. She was also, underneath the tiredness, something else. Something she was still learning to trust. Leander moved from behind the desk and came to stand a few feet from her, not close enough to crowd. Close enough that she could see, clearly, the expression on his face that he was no longer working to conceal. "You said you had shared it for 3 years," he said. "Yes. And you said nothing. Neither did you." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving through the pine trees at the forest edge, with the low, continuous sound of something very large breathing. Inside, the fire and the warmth and the specific gravity of being looked at by this particular person, who had left a blanket at the foot of her bed 18 months ago, rather than walk through a door he hadn't been invited through. "I don't have a wolf," she said, not as a warning, as an honesty. "I never shifted. I don't know if I ever will. In this world, that makes me—" "It makes you Ivy," he said. "That's the entirety of what it makes you." She looked at him. He looked at her. The distance between them was very small and very deliberate, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who has spent 3 years learning the difference between what is said and what is meant, that he was waiting. Not impatiently. Simply waiting, with the absolute stillness of a man who has decided and is giving her the space to decide too. She stepped forward and closed the remaining distance. His hand came up to her face, careful, unhurried, with the restrained certainty of someone who has imagined this moment for long enough that the reality of it requires gentleness. And when she looked up at him in the fire-lit study with the winter wind outside and the weight of 4 days of fear finally releasing from her shoulders, she felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately name, entirely and completely safe. Not because the danger was over, because she was not facing it alone. The weeks that followed were not easy. Ivy had not expected them to be. The review of Kaylin Drev's correspondence took 3 weeks and produced evidence that was, in the words of the Northern Council's senior adjudicator, broader and more deliberate than initially indicated. There had been other arrangements, other names. 2 minor lords in the Eastern Reach who had been complicit in varying degrees, one of whom had been receiving altered trade records from inside Veldrath for nearly 2 years. Records that Roland had quietly modified, small changes that accumulated into a pattern only visible when the full correspondence was laid out in sequence across the council table. The picture that emerged was not of a single desperate act, but of a slow, patient dismantling. Kaylin Drev had been building leverage against Leander for a long time, and Ivy had been, in his calculations, the final and most intimate piece. She sat in on 2 of the council sessions, not as a ward, not as a dependent. Leander had asked her, on the morning of the first session, whether she wished to be present, and when she said yes, he had given her a chair at the table, rather than a place along the wall. She noticed the council members noticing. She did not look away from any of them. Kaylin Drev's suspension became permanent removal before the review concluded. The evidence of a second conspiracy, an attempt, 18 months prior, to intercept and alter a treaty correspondence between Veldrath and a Northern Allied pack, was sufficient. He was stripped of his Eastern Reach seat on the Northern Council in a formal session with all members present, read the full account of his conduct, and escorted from the council chamber by the keep's guard, while the adjudicator recorded the removal in the official record with the slow, deliberate strokes of a man who understood the weight of what he was writing. Ivy watched from her chair at the table. She felt the moment land, not with triumph, which she had expected to feel, but with something quieter and more complete. Justice, she was learning, did not feel like winning. It felt like the restoration of something that should never have been taken. It felt like ground returning under her feet. Kaylin looked at her once as he was escorted out. She held his gaze without expression and let him look, and then he was gone, and the chamber doors closed, and the adjudicator set down his pen, and the thing was finished. Roland had left Veldrath the same night he was confronted, as agreed. His daughter's husband's debts were settled through the keep's accounts within a fortnight, quietly and without fanfare, because Leander had said he would do it, and Leander did not make promises he did not keep. Ivy learned this not from Leander directly, but from Marin, who had learned it from the account's steward, who had been instructed to handle it without comment. She thought about that for a long time. The fact that he had honored an agreement made to a man who had betrayed him, simply because the agreement had been made. It told her something she was still learning the full shape of, that his sense of fairness was not contingent on being owed it. She told him so one evening in the library when the fire was low and the keep was quiet, and they had developed over the preceding weeks the easy habit of spending late evenings in the same room without the careful management of distance that had characterized 3 years of shared space. He was reading correspondence. She was cross-referencing a territorial map against a record she had found inconsistencies in. It was, she had thought more than once, a very ordinary thing to love. This specific quiet, this particular room, this man reading letters with the same focused attention he brought to everything. "You settled Roland's arrangement," she said. "You didn't have to." He looked up. "I said I would." "He betrayed your trust for 14 months. "Yes." He set the correspondence down. "And I told him the terms. If I had held back the settlement as punishment, I would have been the one who broke the agreement. Not him." She looked at him across the library table. "Most people would not have made the agreement in the first place. Most people let anger make their decisions," he said. "I've found it's a poor strategist." She returned to her map. After a moment, she said, "It's one of the things She stopped. He waited. "One of the things I have always found difficult to look at directly," she finished, which was not the sentence she had started, but was true and accurate, and communicated the same thing without requiring her to say the word love in the library with the fire burning low, which she was not quite ready for yet. She was getting there. She was nearly there. But the habit of containment was old, and it was giving way gradually rather than all at once, and he seemed to understand that without being told. He went back to his correspondence. His mouth had done something quiet at one corner. She looked back at her map and felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. On the last day of the month, Maren came to find her. She found Ivy in her room. The small room she had occupied for 3 years, though its quality had quietly improved over the past weeks in ways she had not requested and had not questioned. A thicker wool blanket, a second candle bracket, a small jar of dried lavender on the windowsill that smelled clean and domestic, and exactly right. Maren stood in the doorway with the expression she wore when she had something important to say, and was deciding how directly to say it. "He has spoken to the council," Maren said. "Formally, about your status in this household." Ivy set down the book she had been reading. "What did he say?" "He proposed a formal recognition. Not a ward arrangement. A permanent household designation, with full council acknowledgement." Maren paused. "He also indicated his personal intentions. For the record, the council adjudicator apparently required 3 separate confirmations that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was, in fact, stating what he appeared to be stating." Ivy was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the last of the winter light was going gold across the inner courtyard stones, and somewhere in the keep below, the kitchen fires were being built up for the evening meal, and the smell of wood smoke and roasting herbs was drifting up through the old stone walls in the way it did every evening, familiar and grounding and entirely real. "He didn't tell me he was doing that," she said. "No," Maren agreed. "He told the council first, and is apparently waiting to tell you after, which is either very formal or very nervous, and I cannot decide which." She paused. "Possibly both." Ivy stood up. She found him in the study, where else, standing at the window with his back to the door, looking out over the pine trees at the forest edge, where the last daylight was going amber and then gray. He turned when she entered, and she saw immediately the thing she had seen in glimpses over the past weeks, more and more often. The expression underneath the control, the one that was not Alpha King, and not strategist, and not the careful managed stillness she had spent 3 years reading from across rooms. Just him, just Leander, with his pale blue eyes and his braided hair, and the particular quality of presence that had been making it difficult for her to breathe normally for longer than she was entirely comfortable admitting. "You went to the council," she said. "Yes. Before telling me." "I wanted it to be on record before I asked you," he said, "so that you would know it wasn't contingent on your answer. The recognition stands regardless. Your place here is not a negotiation." She stopped in the middle of the room and looked at him, and felt the last of the old containment finally, fully release. Not with drama, not with the sharp pain she had expected, but with the quiet exhale of something that had been held too long finally being let go. "I don't have a wolf," she said. For the last time, she thought. The last time she would say it, as though it were a reason to be held at a distance. I know. In a world built around shift status and rank and mate bonds, I am, by every formal measure, the least appropriate choice for the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Yes, he said, and I have never cared less about a formal measure in my life. She crossed the room. He met her halfway. Of course he did. He had always been meeting her halfway. She understood that now. Understood all the small, careful ways he had moved in her direction for years, without ever crossing a line she hadn't indicated she would welcome. And when she reached him, his hands came to her face with the same careful certainty as they had in this room weeks ago, and she looked up at him in the fading winter light and said, "Yes, to whatever you were going to ask. Yes." His exhale was very quiet. His forehead came down against hers, and they stood like that for a moment in the study that smelled of wood smoke and old paper and cedar, while the last of the daylight faded outside the high windows, and the keep settled into its evening sounds around them. Footsteps in corridors, the low voices of the guard change, the distant rhythm of the kitchen, the wind in the pines. In the spring, when the frost finally released from the courtyard stones and the forest at Veldrath's edge turned green and soft with new growth, Ivy stood in the great hall before the Northern Council, and was formally recognized as companion to the Alpha King. Not ward, not dependent, not asset to be managed or leverage to be used, but companion, chosen and choosing, with full standing and full name recorded in the Council's permanent register. Marin stood along the left wall and did not cry, because she was constitutionally opposed to crying in formal settings. But her expression was the expression of someone who had waited for a long time to see something set right, and was now watching it be set right, and that was enough. Lord Bastian Vorn, who had returned to Thornfeld after his diplomatic visit, and then quietly sent a letter to Leander, indicating that he had found his brief conversation with Ivy unusually memorable, and hoped the keep was treating its more remarkable staff appropriately, received a formal reply informing him that the keep was, in fact, treating her very well, and that the Alpha King sent his regards. Lord Bastian, by all accounts, read this letter with a wide smile, and then told his steward that he had suspected as much from the moment he'd seen a certain pair of pale blue eyes track across a crowded hall. Kaelin Drev returned to the Eastern Reach estate, stripped of his council seat and his political influence, and spent the following years under the quiet and permanent supervision of a crown-appointed review officer. He caused no further trouble. Whether this was because he had learned something, or because he had simply recognized the cost of trying again, was a question Ivy found she did not need answered. He was gone from the spaces she inhabited, and that was sufficient. The two minor lords who had been complicit in his correspondence scheme were removed from their advisory positions and replaced by appointees with no Eastern Reach entanglements, a restructuring that Leander managed in a single council session with the efficient finality of a man closing a chapter he had no interest in revisiting. Roland was not heard from again. The debts were settled. The arrangement was kept. Whatever remained of the man's conscience was his own to live with, and Ivy found over time that she did not spend much thought on him. The betrayal had been real. The damage had been real. But the damage had also led her, by the particular cruel logic of catastrophe, directly to the moment she had stopped pretending, and she could not bring herself to wish the path entirely different when she was standing at the end of it. On the first warm evening of spring, Ivy sat at the window of what was no longer the Omega's room, but simply her room, larger now, south-facing, with a view of the inner garden, where the first herbs were coming in green and small against the dark soil, and she braided her pale hair in front of a mirror that did not crack. The keep was quiet around her, in the particular way of a place that is at peace. Somewhere below, she could hear Leander in the corridor speaking with Soren in the low, unhurried tone of a man reviewing the evening's security arrangements, and in a few minutes he would knock twice on her door, which was the habit they had developed, and she would say, "Come in," which was the answer she always gave, and they would spend the evening the way they had spent the past several months of evenings, together, in the same room, in the specific ordinary warmth of two people who had spent 3 years saying nothing, and intended, for the rest of their lives, to say everything. She finished the braid, set down the comb, looked at herself in the mirror. She did not look like someone waiting to be seen. She looked like someone who had finally, completely arrived. 2 knocks at the door. "Come in," she said, and she meant it. All of it. Every part of what those 2 words had come to hold. With every piece of herself. Without reservation. Without silence. Without the careful maintenance of a distance that had never, not once, protected her from anything that mattered. The door opened. And that was that. And it was enough. It was, at last, entirely enough.